Hello, good evening, everybody. Thanks for watching this video once again. Here am I, your boy Shrimp, and thank you for coming here and clicking on this video. Hopefully that you will enjoy this video. Once again, this is a video for me exercising my art, trying to improve my skills, and also listening to some audiobook of some light novels or web novels. And so yeah, it's been a while. I've been out for an entire week, I think. Yeah, an entire week. It's all because of a a really stupid and very important reason. Well, it's all because of reading One Piece for the entire week. I needed to catch up. I was so tempted when I heard about the movie, so I went and catch up on One Piece. And last time I uh, last time I was read or caught up, or what was the term? I forgot. But yeah, last chapter probably that I read was about. Let me cut off the music first. Yeah, the last chapters that I've read before beginning was probably them going up to the land of Zoa, the elephant. So I started there and then continued until I managed to finish the entire series for an entire week. So yeah, from Zoa to Big Mom and to Wano Country until the end of the arc. So yeah, I finished that all for an entire week. I could probably do it much quicker if I managed to do it also at the morning, but I could only do it at night because it's my only free time. But yeah, uh, props to me finally finishing it, and then watching the One Piece movie read at the evening, the at the evening. So yeah. So now that was over, let us continue with my art here, and let's see. So yeah, this is where we left off. I managed to put on the base color of this design. Uh, I'm thinking of changing the color of the skin, probably because it's kind of too reddish. But I'll see what I can do first before going to edit that. But yeah, anyways, most of the coloring is pretty much solid. It just needs of touching up, kind of blending and putting some secondary colors on the design so that it will make it more livelier, more natural. Okay, so yeah, I will begin to finalize the coloring for this, and I'll pretty much focus on the character so that I can edit some of the things that I've kind of brush up over here, add some line art or erase some line art, and yeah, adding color. Yeah, so pretty much that's what's the plan right now. So yeah, thank you again for coming here today and watching this. I will begin to play the audiobook. So once again, we're reading from the Dead Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. We're now in chapter 20. I think we're still in volume 1. So right now, uh, so yeah, we're gonna enter volume 2 around chapter 27. So here we are in chapter 20. So pretty much we can do at least 3 chapters today. So probably after 2 more videos or 3, we will start the volume 2. I'll change the the thumbnail finally. It's been a while that I've changed the thumbnail, but yeah. So, without any further ado, let's us continue with this story and with this
Chapter
design.
20. Let us smash the noble pigs' noses. You pig-headed cowards. Do you not have the courage to come and face me? With a disheveled mane and bared fangs, Vigoro let out a roar and jeered at the orcs. Though the orcs and goblins standing in his way likely didn't understand his words, they retreated as if they were afraid of him. Vigoro's role in this battle was to act as a diversion. One glance at Vigoro was enough to tell that he was highly ranked among the ghouls. Leading a group of 10 warriors including female mages, he made a show of rampaging around, defeating every enemy that came into his sight. The plan was to have a separate group including Buzz to rescue the captive women while this was happening. It was a simple plan. If their enemies were humans, they would have quickly realized that it was a diversion. However, it worked against monsters. Aggressive behavior is something that all monsters have in common. With members of their own race being killed by Vigoro and his group, they could not help but to focus their attention on him. Orcs in particular were a race that were quick to become enraged, and Vigoro had even quickly defeated the leaders like the orc generals. There was no time for them to gather their troops together. A rare kind of orc called an orc tamer set monsters like wood wolves, huge boars and giant pythons on the ghouls, but even those were easily crushed. They were nothing compared to the undead led by Vandali. I didn't have a hard time at all fighting against the orc generals that are supposed to be of the same rank as me. Rather than me having become stronger, this is Vandali's work. The effects of their strength and follower skill and the battle axe that was a magic item that Vigoro had been given. Even the various supportive spells cast on him by the mages were still active because Vandali had transferred his mana to the mages to recast them. And when Vigoro and his group had encountered orc mages and goblin mages that would have been difficult opponents, Vandali had appeared out of nowhere to release a black fog that surrounded the enemy mages and sealed their magic. That was why they were experiencing such an overwhelming victory with not even a single injury, let alone a casualty. The ghouls did feel a little shameful to be completely dependent on this child, but ghoul society placed value on ability. It was only natural for superior individuals to stand at the top. And Vigoro understood that Vandali was superior to himself. Without a doubt, Vigoro had the advantage in muscle strength and physical ability. In battle techniques, too. However, Vandali had the overwhelming advantage when it came to magic and mana. And above all, he possessed their strength and follower skill, the skill that a superior individual should have. I have the capacity to become the chief of 100 ghouls, and Vandali has the capacity to stand above me. Vigoro understood this. However, he couldn't help but to feel pathetic. As he was now. Wasn't he pathetic for someone serving under Vandali? No, for someone who was Vandali's family member? Bugger. That was why when Vigoro heard a roar even more powerful than an orc general's, both corners of his mouth twisted upwards in a smile. There was a young noble orc whose body that was over 2 meters tall made Vigoro look small in comparison. His features seemed to be made out of pure ugliness and pride other than his brilliantly shining blonde hair. As his rage-filled pupils spotted Vigoro from a height of 3 meters, his expression softened into one of scorn. He would scatter these insolent small fries in place of his useless subordinates. That was clearly what he was thinking. A noble orc. Vigoro, what are we going to do? Seeing not an enemy of the same rank as Vigoro like an orc general, but a powerful noble orc that was clearly a superior foe, even these elite ghouls couldn't conceal their unrest. Vigoro was a rank 5 ghoul barbarian, and this enemy was a rank 6 noble orc. Though the number was only different by 1, the actual difference was significant. Generally, in battles between monsters, if 2 monsters face off head-to-head starting at healthy conditions, the higher rank one will win unless the other monster has some significant advantage. No matter how much experience a fox has and how much it practices its skills, there is no way it can win a head-on fight against a tiger. Vigoro himself had once said that if he were to fight a noble orc, he would definitely lose. What are we going to do, you say? We fight. But right now, he didn't feel as if he would lose. Letting out the roar of a lion, Vigoro closed the distance between himself and the noble orc. Looking down at him, the noble orc performed a sideways sweep with his own axe that was even larger than the axe that Vigoro had received from Vandali. Vigoro crouched close to the ground as if crawling to avoid the blow that could have sent his head flying if it connected. He felt anger at the fact that some of his mane was cut off, but before paying too much attention to that, he used 3 of his limbs to leap sideways. Bugich. The reason Vigoro did that was because the axe that was supposed to pass over his head instead came swinging down with a loud crash. Normally, axes have bad balance and after swinging them once, time is needed to prepare one's stance again. Regaining one's balance immediately after swinging an axe is impossible. But the noble orc's incredible physical ability made it possible. Boo-oo-oo. It swung its axe consecutively with no technique, only pure physical strength. It seemed that there were plenty of openings in between, but if Vigoro were to let up his focus on evasion to attack that opening, he would likely be cut to shreds. Vigoro kept dodging the attacks nimbly. One of his hands was still holding his axe while the other gripped the earth and helped him kick his body off its surface to avoid the noble orc's attacks. Each of the noble orc's swings contained terrifying power, and its physical strength made them quick as well. But each of its movements was obvious and linear. Against an opponent like Vigoro, it was like telling him, I'm going to attack like this, right now, before every swing. Gaia. Buihi. Woyu. Vigoro, the noble orc, and the warriors that each of them led were engaged in battle. Vigoro had an idea of how the battle was progressing through the ghoul's battle language, but the noble orc's head was completely focused on his ghoul opponent in front of him. Why wouldn't any of its attacks land on him? He was one of his great father's sons, the strongest of them all, Bugibilio. Why could he not land a single attack on something like this ghoul? For noble orcs, male ghouls were just small fry and female ghouls were nothing but meat pots. So why were such ghouls making him embarrass himself in front of his subordinates and slaves? Bugger. With his rage and irritation taking over, the noble orc unleashed the martial skill bisection. It was a level 2 martial skill, but even if a human were to use it, it would be powerful enough to cut down a tree in one strike. If a noble orc used it, it was capable of smashing a boulder. However, the more powerful the noble orc's attack, the larger the opening following it was. Vigoro avoided it and made great use of the chance at a counterattack that he had finally found. Axe whip. Vigoro's long arm bent loosely like a whip. Bop. The noble orc immediately tried to bend backwards to avoid it, but Vigoro's long arm bent once more and his axe inflicted a deep cut in the noble orc's right arm. Gah! Vigoro's right hand left the handle of his battle axe. And then he gripped the mid-air battle axe with his left hand and dash. He used his martial skill once more. Boo-boo-ee. The noble orc deflected the axe aimed at his neck with his own axe. But after Vigoro's axe was repelled, his arm suddenly changed direction and severed the noble orc's right leg, which the noble orc hadn't been paying attention to. Unable to keep his balance, the noble orc toppled over sideways. This time, Vigoro's axe dug its way deep into his neck and decapitated him. The whip technique, in which the user increases the flexibility of his arm and flings it like a whip, and the triple axe whip technique, in which the process is repeated consecutively. These were martial skills taught only to the long-armed ghoul men. Who's next? Vigoro let out a roar of victory and stamped down on the head of the noble orc, which was still wearing the screaming expression at the moment of his death. Seeing this fearsome sight, the orc knights began to fall apart and flee for their lives, but there was no way that these slow orcs could get away. The few remaining goblins and kobolds followed their masters into the grave. Grrrr. How's that, Vandali? Your family is strong. There was a small child who had called the ghouls his family, gotten involved in a battle he didn't need to get involved in, and even took on the title of king. Even now, he was working harder than any of the ghouls. How could Vigoro call himself a young chief, a warrior, if he didn't produce results that could make that child proud? Standing in a pitter-pattering rain of blood, Vigoro gave a pride-filled roar. Bgogan's third son, Budibis, had absolute confidence in his own beautiful looks and his skill with a bow. He wasn't proficient in close-quarters combat like his brothers. But he believed that a noble should not clash with their inferior prey directly and become stained in an unsightly way by their blood. He believed that a noble should shoot their prey from a distance with elegance. When he had heard a report that there was a group of ghouls being led by a female ghoul, he could only think of how fitting the prey was for him. That group apparently contained many female ghouls. His only thoughts were of capturing them, picking out ones that he fancied, presenting the other attractive ones to his father and distributing the rest among his subordinates, thus placing him in a superior position to his brothers. Budgia. He had no intention of letting his guard down. He had given 5 orc knights the honor of serving as his advance guard, and also brought with him 10 orcs and 30 small fry goblins. At first, things were going well. Their warriors serving as Zediris's advance guard were unable to completely stop Budibis's subordinates, and his arrow powerful enough to pierce straight through an adventurer in full plate armor was only barely stopped by the female ghoul's wind attribute magic. At this rate, the female ghouls would run out of mana in less than 5 minutes, and then the orcs could push into them. Budibis was confident in his victory. And then much more than 5 minutes passed and the female ghouls had showed no signs of running out of mana. Geeeee. Instead, a group of undead attacked from the side. With clouds of the rotten beast's poisonous breaths floating around and a phantom bird's long-ranged fire from its spirit wings raining down, Budibis and his subordinates were shaken. In the opening created by the undead, the female ghouls rallied, causing even more unrest in Budibis's forces, and then the rotten beasts rushed in. The female ghouls had been supposed to run out of mana long ago, but they were releasing spells towards Budibis even now. Budibis's subordinates who were supposed to have pushed into the female ghouls were instead pushed into, and turned into twitching, blood-stained corpses. Bugibilio. Babio. Boo. With his face that he conceitedly believed to be beautiful twisted in fear, Budibis called for help from the brothers that he secretly looked down on and the father that he despised. However, what reached out to him was not the helping hand of his family members, but the cold hand of death. TCH, how noisy! Great wind blade. The enormous, great sword-sized blade of wind created by Zadyrus's spell cut Budibis in half horizontally as he tried to make an unsightly escape. Budibis managed to take a few more steps with the top and bottom half of his body still intact, but then his strength gave out and he collapsed, his organs spilling onto the ground. Few surprisingly, he was not a greatly difficult foe, but he was a noisy rascal with a scream that pierced the ears. Boy, we are fine now. As Zadyrus exhaled, a semi-transparent, thin, string-like object detached from her shoulder. This was Vandali's spirit form that had been transferring her mana. He had apparently attached it to Bonebird and had it bring it to her. Without even seeing Bonebird off, Zadyrus raised her staff high. Everyone. There are few enemies left. But do not let down your guard. A short while earlier, the group of ghoul warriors including Bazdia quickly finished securing the building containing the captive ghoul women. There had been orc guards here as well, but it seemed that their primary job had been to make sure none of the other orcs did anything excessive to the women rather than to prevent the women from escaping. As they hadn't planned on killing members of their own race, they weren't very well equipped. And the ones who had come here to procreate had been even more poorly equipped. They might as well have been fully naked. The outer wall turning into wood columns had caused the village to fall into a state of chaos. Most of the orcs had tried to run out of the buildings while goblins and less intelligent orcs tried to get into them. Bazdia and her group had charged in during the middle of this large traffic jam and cleaned them up quickly before things escalated into a proper battle. The women inside the buildings were in a terrible state. In order to keep captive the ghoul women who possessed their superhuman strength skill, their bodies had been immobilized by being half buried in boulders, likely with a spell cast by the orc mages or noble orcs. In addition, it seemed that they had been tormented. There were whip marks on their skin. There were some women who weren't in this state, but they had been treated just as horribly. Their hands and feet had been deliberately broken. Ghouls had much more vitality compared to humans, so they functioned as tools to give birth to orc children with no problems even if they were treated horribly. That was why they had been treated this way. The human women in the same building, the ghouls expected them to be in better conditions, and that expectation was correct. They couldn't say this out loud after seeing their actual situation, however. Unlike most monsters, the ghoul women had a sense of values. Perhaps this was why they were not rendered mentally crippled, even after receiving such deep emotional scars. What do we do with these women? But the human women seemed completely broken. Their eyes were lifeless and their bodies were limp, like corpses. Even though the humans were mortal enemies for the ghouls, as a fellow woman, Bazdia couldn't help but to sympathize for them. She wanted to do something for them, but hearing words from her allies in the ghouls' battle language, Bazdia recollected her thoughts. The meaning of those words were, a powerful enemy is approaching. Boo. Bazdia came out to the front of the buildings to see an enraged noble orc with fangs bared, as well as orc knights guarding him with shields raised. Her companions didn't hesitate to call for reinforcements. None of the ghouls here, including Bazdia, possessed outstanding ability in combat. They could easily defeat orc knights, but a noble orc would be too difficult. Even factoring in the supportive spells and difference in equipment, there was no way that this group of rank 3 and 4 ghouls could win against 10 rank 4 orc knights led by a rank 6 noble orc. In fact, they would be trampled one-sidedly. Did their leader decide to dedicate some of his forces to recapture the women? I would have thought that they would be headed to where Vigoro and the others are. Seeing the noble orc arrogantly looking down upon them, Bazdia couldn't help but to wonder this out loud. In fact, the reason the ghouls had come here was so that the noble orcs and their subordinates wouldn't use the ghoul women as hostages. But on the other hand, there was nothing more of value here. Even if the noble orcs defeated Bazdia and the other ghouls here, the battle would definitely not go well for the orcs as the groups led by Vigoro, Zadyrus and Vandali would be able to move about freely. Recapturing the women would increase the orcs' morale to some extent, but it would not increase their strength in battle. Common sense would have told the orcs that it would be a better decision to leave Bazdia's group alone, instead dealing with Vigoro and Zadyrus's groups. Of course, most monsters didn't possess common sense, but everyone had expected that at least monsters with the noble orc's intelligence would have made that decision. Bufufufu. However, the young noble orc looking down on Bazdia and her group, Babio, was a noble orc that defied those expectations. He was aware that the battle would not turn around with just the efforts of his subordinates and slaves, but had confidence that if he stepped into battle himself, he could win. Like his brothers, he led his subordinates to act separately from them and add achievements to his own name. The thought of helping his brothers didn't occur to him at all. His head only contained thoughts of defeating them and currying favor with his father. Gubababu. That was why Babayo had chosen to secure women. There were no noble orc or orc women, they were races made up entirely of males. In order to preserve themselves, the females of other races were absolutely necessary. If he were to recapture the women for the village, it would become a highly valued achievement. That was what Babayo thought. It was a choice not to win the battle, but a choice brought about by the thought of gaining the greatest achievement to his name while exercising the least effort. It was only natural for him to decide against what would be considered common sense. Boo-oo-oo-oo. Pointing the tips of their prided great swords in the direction of the ghouls, the orc knights raised their shields and lowered their center of gravity in a prepared stance. GRR. They're going to charge in. Gar. By some time. They had to somehow hold out until reinforcements arrived. Basdia and the other ghouls hardened their resolve while the 10 orc knights simultaneously charged in while using their shield bash skalor as they began to, the ground surface began to move. The ground turned into dozens of earth golems that stood to face the orc knights. But there was no way that these brittle clay doll-like golems could stop the shield bash of orcs that weighed over 100 kilograms. They should crumble instantly, but budgia? Before the orc knights clashed against the earth golems, their legs were caught in holes in the ground, causing them to fall down. Earth golems were made from the dirt on the ground. It was only natural that holes with the same volume as the golems would form. And then the earth golems collapsed on top of the fallen orc knights, burying them alive. After seeing these unbelievable events unfold, both the ghouls and Babayo were silent. They were more effective than I thought. These golem-made improvised pitfalls. Oh, such tremendous technique. As to be expected from you, Botchan. You even gave them a burial. Though we'll have to dig them up again later. With the rattling of carriage wheels, Vandali and Sam appeared. Vivan? Yes, it's me. There's still the noble orc left, so let's not let our guard down. You're right. And the enemy's head is still intact, so please defeat him quickly. Well, that goes without saying. Wait a minute, you want me to defeat him? Yes, from an experience point perspective. Basdia was flustered and surprised, but Vandali requested that she defeat Babayo as if it was the obvious thing for her to do. It's alright, I'm going to support you. No, I think it's impossible for me to defeat a noble orc even with you supporting me. It's impossible because you think it's impossible. Even that shitty professor that valued results over anything said that. And you're alright with learning from those words? But you know, he was really a rotten-brained, idiot professor. Even though Vandali was the laboratory animal, the professor should have been the one taking responsibility when the experiments didn't succeed. But he always said things like, you don't have enough spirit. He was a nagging, disagreeable fellow. The only time The only time Vandali had a positive feeling towards him was when he let out his dying scream. Looking at Babayo, Vandali recalled that professor's blonde hair. It's fine, if I support you, Bastia, you won't die. He's coming this way now! Exclamation mark. With a sigh, Bastia raised her axe. Babayo stood before her, trembling with rage. Babayo was enraged at the fact that Vandali and Basdia had forgotten him and were having an enjoyable conversation together. With a roar, he raised his great sword. As he did so, the ground beneath which the orc knights were buried began to crawl. Vandali was calm. He knew that he hadn't managed to dig holes deep enough to kill the orcs instantly, so he had been expecting that they would emerge eventually. Rita, Saria and everyone else, please finish off the ones that are buried. Bastia, let's defeat the noble orc together. Q, alright. Still wondering if she would really be alright, Bastia stepped forward. From behind her came the screams of the orc knights who had managed to finally crawl out of the ground, only to be slaughtered by a glaive, halberd or ghoul claws. Boo-oo-oo. Babayo charged towards Basdia with the force of a brick wall. And then he swung his great sword towards her head with a speed too fast to be seen by the eyes. Evade to the right. Basdia obeyed her instincts to dodge that lethal attack that her eyes couldn't follow. Boo, boo. As if dissatisfied that his lethal attack had been evaded, Babayo forcefully pulled his great sword back and performed a thrust. A half step to the left. And in the next moment, Basdia had evaded that thrust as well. Boo-oo. Boo-gog-oo. As if panicking now that he had been dodged a second time, Babayo began unleashing attacks one after another. A sideways sweeping single flash, a diagonal flowing cut from above, a triple thrust aimed at Basdia's neck, stomach and leg. If any of these brutal attacks landed, they would have been fatal regardless of Basdia's well-trained body and high-quality armor. But Basdia evaded them all. Just how? How could this female ghoul move so fast? Why did Babayo's blade not find its target, even though he was supposed to be unrivaled? The expression on Babayo's face had gone beyond anger, and there was now even some fear of Bazdia. How am I able to dodge these attacks? And even Bazdia was surprised. Indeed, after the battle so far, she had seen that Babayo wasn't particularly highly skilled. He was about as skilled as she was. However, there was a vast difference in their basic physical strength. If Bazdia was lucky, she would be able to dodge one or two attacks. But having these attacks unleashed one after the other should have ended in her being chopped to pieces. But for some reason, Bazdia had known what she needed to do to avoid dying. She had sensed that she needed to move right, immediately did exactly that, and the great sword had swung down at the spot that she had been standing. She had sensed that she needed to take half a step back, and then the tip of the great sword had passed right in front of her. As if she could see the future, she had known what she needed to do to survive. It was as if she had acquired such a sight skill. I see, this is Vandali's support. A cool, soft hand was supporting her. It was this hand that was telling her how to avoid being killed. Vandali's arm, which he had used spirit form transformation in, had fused with Bazdia's back. Through that arm, Vandali applied the danger sense, death that was constantly active for himself to Bazdia. Danger sense, death was a skill that detected the danger of death, which meant that it could definitely detect each of Babayo's lethal attacks. Danger sense, death wouldn't detect the attacks of a kobold sword whose individual swings inflicted only light damage. If Babayo had simply kept his composure and mixed feints in with his attacks, things might not have turned out so one-sided. However, the enraged, impatient, scared Babayo was unable to keep his composure and repeated only these lethal attacks that would kill in one hit. The three brothers, Babayo, Bubidas and Bugaibilio, were weak compared to the noble orc race as a whole. Rather than them having been born this way, their weakness was a result of the environment that they had grown up in and Bugogan's failure to train them adequately. Since they had been born after Bugogan had made his escape from his home into this devil's nest, they had been surrounded by nothing but servant orcs and slave goblins and kobolds from the moment they were born. They had made most things work with the physical strength that they were blessed with from birth, and all the enemies they had faced were foes that were easily defeated by swinging weapons at them, not requiring them to improve their techniques. Naturally, they neglected their studies, and since they faced only lower-rank enemies, their levels didn't increase and their combat-related skills didn't go beyond level 3. The rivals that they did compete against were their brothers that were just the same as themselves, so rather than working hard, they simply competed over who could get the easiest achievements. If this had been a harsh environment such as the large devil's nest to the south that housed many other noble orcs and other monsters that could challenge them, Babayo and his brothers would have been forced to work hard to survive. The noble orcs thought that children who could raise themselves were superior, while children that required the parents to directly raise them were inferior. If Bugogan had discarded this notion and trained his sons himself, then perhaps they would have had high-level martial and magic skills. Instead, what he had produced were three foolish sons who had only experienced easy victories against weaker foes. They hadn't had any problems with this until now. Their enemies were all inferior, after all. However, Bazdia and the other ghouls were far more diligent than the orcs in training themselves. Vandali and Terra had even provided them with equipment even better than that of adventurers. Factoring in the supportive spells and the effects of their strength and followers kill, this was more than enough to overcome a rank difference of 1. Even then, Bazdia would have a hard time defeating a noble orc without taking any damage. But with Vandali's support, she wouldn't die. Since a one-on-one battle would only end when one of the participants died, the outcome of this battle was already clear. Buich. Now out of breath, the noble orc's movements became noticeably slower and it stopped using its martial skills. Using martial skills normally consumes mana, but in this case, it also drained stamina as well. Bisection. Buich. And then Bazdia went on the attack and Babayo's arm was severed by her axe. She unleashed a merciless series of martial skills, as if returning the favor. Strong flash, instant response, single flash. As Babayo tried to turn and run, he toppled forward as Bazdia's axe, empowered by the weapon-throwing skill lightning attack, buried itself in the back of his head. I defeated him, Van. I defeated a noble orc. Bazdia was likely exhilarated at the fact that she had gained a large amount of experience points by defeating this powerful enemy. She rushed over to Sam's carriage and picked Vandali up and started swinging him around. You defeated him, so please put me down. He was happy that Bazdia was so overjoyed, but having his vision shaken up, down, left and right wasn't a pleasant experience. The other ghouls wouldn't stop cheering, either. But it was fortunate that Basdia had gained the experience points, just as he had planned. Vandali couldn't gain experience points on his own because of his curse, and even if he could he was already level 100, so it would have been pointless for him to gain the experience points himself. That was why he had wanted Basdia, who could use the experience points, to defeat the noble orc. Now, we have to deal with these guys, Bugoa. An angry roar came from the largest house in the village, interrupting Vandali. At the same time, the walls of that house began to collapse from the inside, but even the sounds of the walls falling were drowned out by the roar. A noble orc well over 3 meters tall appeared. He was holding a magic sword with a 2-meter-long blade and wore an extravagant suit of armor. Even Vandali and the group of ghouls that was with him could see this noble orc. They were rendered speechless. The happiness that they had felt moments earlier had vanished, and they were now trembling in fear instead. But it couldn't be helped. This was a true noble orc. This was a monster that could rival a dragon. Vandali took this opportunity to slip away from Basdia's arms and analyzed how much of a threat Bgogan was with danger sense, death. He wondered how they would win this battle. If he cooperated with Basdia to fight him, no matter what he did, Basdia would die. If he waited for Zadiris and used magic as their primary way to fight, no matter what he did, the rear guard including Zadiris and the ghouls of the advance guard would die. If he used Vigoro at the center of his tactics, no matter what he did, no matter how good or bad his luck was, Vigoro would die. If he used Zadiris, Vigoro and Basdia as the primary fighting force while also combining the strength of himself, Sam and the other undead, he thought he could win. But no matter how good their luck was, some of them would die. If Andali stepped forward to face Bgogan alone, with everyone else just supporting him, there was more than a 50% chance that he would die, but only a 10% chance that the others would die. Well then, please lend me your support. Before anyone could express their surprise at these words, Vandali used the no attribute spell Fly to float into the air, and then flew towards Bgogan with the speed of a bullet. Chapter 21, An Unsightly, Humorous Boss Fight. Up until he heard his foolish, idiotic son's dying screams, Bgogan had finished his preparations for battle, but remained seated on his throne. The reason for that was because he was the ruling king. The king was not supposed to step out onto the battlefield. That was the job of his achievement-hungry sons, their subordinates and the slaves. That was why Bgogan had simply sat on his throne, reprimanded the failures that were his subordinates and ordered his sons to join the battle. And then he became aware that his servants and slaves had perished, and his sons had been slaughtered. At that moment, Bgogan's rage exceeded its limits. Bugger! He unsheathed his prided magic sword and stood up from his throne and destroyed the walls of this building that had taken longer to build than the other orc dwellings, but was still nothing more than a shabby house. Sending splinters of wood flying, he gave yet another roar. His rage wouldn't settle down at all. How much effort had he put into increasing the numbers of the foolish orcs to this extent? No matter how stupid, foolish and inexperienced they were, how long had it taken him to create sons? It hadn't been easy to gather slaves, women, weapons and armor, either. All of that hard work was about to be nullified in a single night. He couldn't hold himself back anymore. These insolent ghouls who had attacked his village. He would slaughter all of the males, capture every single female and have them give birth to as many orcs as had been killed tonight. As Bgogan lost himself in his rage, he saw something flying towards him with incredible speed. Bgogan didn't think it was more than something in the background until it was about 10 meters in front of him. And even now that he had noticed that it was there, he forgot his rage for a moment and wondered what this thing was. It looked like a human child with long, white hair, white skin, a right eye as red as blood and a bluish-purple left eye. For a moment Bgogan thought that this was a young female ghoul, but the ears that could be seen protruding through its hair were pointed. Did this creature possess elf blood mixed into its veins? The reason Bgogan was confused at this child's appearance was that he felt nothing from it. No presence, no sound, no smell, no bloodthirst, no hostility, no fear. He felt nothing at all. If someone explained it to him by saying that he was having a hallucination, he would have believed it. This creature that he felt absolutely nothing from was so bizarre that he thought it might disappear if he closed his eyes and opened them again. Still floating in the air, it held its arms out as if to block his path, wrapping black mana around itself. Finally, Bgogan realized that this was an enemy. The noble orc Bgogan. The ghoul king Vandali. The scene of the two of them preparing to fight each other looked incredibly stupid. At first, while Vandali was covering himself in black mana and casting his impact-negating barrier and magic absorption barrier, Bugogan was simply staring at him blankly. Fuga. As Vandali finished casting his spells, Bugogan gave a short chant. A spear of earth suddenly appeared from below Vandali. It looked as if it was going to turn him into a skewer, but the moment its tip touched the impact-negating barrier, it turned back into fragile dirt. Combined together, impact-negating barrier and magic absorption barrier absorbed all of the power from any attack that originated outside the barriers. Electrical energy would be absorbed from lightning, heat energy would be absorbed from flame and, of course, mana would be absorbed from spells. Bugogan's spells were quickly rendered useless. Bufu, bugger. With that, he had likely discerned the effect of the barriers. Thinking that unarmed combat would be more effective than magic, Bugogan raised his magic sword. Bugaga. And in the next instant, he had closed the distance between himself and Vandali. With a speed that was unbelievable coming from his enormous body that was 3 meters in both width and height, he swung his magic sword down. His attack looked like it could cut a rock in half as if it were paper, but it was blocked by impact-negating barrier and didn't even land a scratch on Vandali. Impact-negating barrier absorbed not only the mana, but also the kinetic energy of the weapon. Kinetic energy is the energy needed to make a physical object move. To move a 10-kilogram dumbbell, 10 kilograms of energy is required. As that kinetic energy was absorbed by impact-negating barrier, Bugogan's magic sword could not reach Vandali who was behind it. In response to the strange sensation of having his weapon repelled by a soft wall, Bugogan's face twisted in confusion. With Bugogan's blade stopped right in front of his face, Vandali looked at Bugogan with no expression on his face, but this is what he was thinking. This is bad. I'm going to die. On the surface, it seemed that Vandali was surrounded with an impenetrable defense. However, that impenetrable defense wouldn't last forever. Stopping that one preliminary attack that wasn't even a martial skill or anything cost me 50,000 mana. Vandali had been using his mana excessively since the battle began, he had already spent half of it. He still had more than 50 million remaining, but if Bugogan attacked with a martial skill, it would cost tens of thousands of mana to block it, possibly even hundreds of thousands. Of course, martial skills also consume the user's mana, so they couldn't be used endlessly. However, Bugogan could also use magic, so he would have much more mana than his sons. And his stamina would be even greater than that. If Vandali ran out of mana and his barriers disappeared, he would have no way of escaping Bugogan's attacks. I'm weak, after all. Are you strong? If someone were to ask Vandali this question, he would answer no, I'm weak. He could use death attribute magic that nobody else could use. He possessed over 100 million mana. Because he was a damper at 2 years of age, he possessed more physical strength than an average adult man. But he was weak. If one were to separate everyone in Lambda into the strong and weak, Vandali would undoubtedly fall into the weak category. Death attribute magic was more restricted than other attributes of magic, there were limits to what Vandali could accomplish with it. There were almost no spells that dealt direct damage to the target like Flame Spear, Earth Axe and Wind Strike. Its defensive capabilities were being demonstrated by Vandali right now, but since he could never go on the attack, he would be defeated eventually. And whether he had 100 million mana or 200 million mana, he would die if his vitality dropped to 0. His physical strength was barely stronger than an adult man's. There was no way that it would be a match for this monster that could even challenge a dragon. That was why Vandali was weak. Vandali did not possess a permanent strength that worked in any situation. But that didn't mean that he had the choice to give up and die. Get up. First, he turned the ground beneath Bugogan's feet into golems to try to destroy his footing. His plan was to stop his movements until Basdia and the others got here, and then have them throw endless long-ranged attacks until Bugogan died. Bew. However, Bugogan quickly crushed the earth golems under his feet as they began to move. He stomped downwards with the unarmed martial skill Kicking Strike, and each stomp caused multiple golems to crumble. It was only a tactic to buy time, but Vandali was surprised that he could only buy a few seconds by spending tens of thousands of mana. Next, Vandali fired the no attribute magic spell, Mana Bullet. This was a simple spell where he hardened his mana into a ball and threw it at his target, but since it didn't have any attribute, it was a spell that one could expect to work to some degree against any enemy. He fired off multiple mana bullets the size of his own body containing about 10,000 mana each, aiming for different parts of Bugogan's body with different timings, and then topped it off with a single, extra large mana bullet containing 100,000 mana. Regardless of Bugogan's huge size, this barrage would send Bugogan flying to the edge of the village if they hit. But Bugogan blocked all of them with his magic sword. Boo-oo-oo-oo-oo-oo. He moved his magic sword with incredible speed to repel every single mana bullet. The martial skill instant response increases the user's reaction speed. Bugogan used a superior version of the spell, super instant response, and a defensive spell where the user deflects magic with a sword called Magic Breaker consecutively while channeling mana through the blade of his weapon. Vandali was astonished to see him perform this feat that even a first-class swordsman would find difficult. He was the father of that weak bow bio. Why was he this strong? Vandali's mana control skill was low relative to the amount of mana contained in the deflected mana bullets, so the mana quickly dispersed without affecting the nearby terrain. For some reason, Vandali could sense something inside the house that Bugogan had emerged from with his Sense Life spell, so he was being careful about where he fired. Bower. After repelling all of the mana bullets, Bugogan raised his magic sword in the air and used the martial skill crosscut. The impact negating barrier made an unusual sound. The barrier hadn't been able to absorb all of the destructive power in the magic blade in an instant, so the blade had made it halfway in. I can't hold back here. It seemed that Bugogan had intended to finish things with this attack, so his eyes were wide open in surprise. Vandali looked down at him as he poured mana into the impact negating barrier to repair it and strengthen it even further. The crosscut executed by Bugogan was strong enough that it would cut the average knight or adventurer into 4 pieces. Crosscut was a martial skill that actually had a lower skill level requirement to be effective than super instant response. Bugogan was capable of using even more powerful martial skills than this. If he'd suddenly decided to go all out, I might have died. The impact negating barrier protected Vandali's body from almost any attack, but there was a way to break through it. A single attack focused on one point, containing too much energy for the barrier to absorb. Pushing through by force. The kind of tactic that the main character of a story might use against the villain. Vandali had loved such plot developments when he had lived on Earth, but the problem was that he was on the receiving end of it, and it might actually be possible for Bugogan to accomplish it. There was no way that Vandali could die here, fail to avenge and revive his mother and become some stepping stone for a noble orc's ambitions. He had to think of a way to kill him. He decided to position a lemur behind Bugogan. And then he would unleash a mana bolt at the same time the lemur released its bloodthirst. Bugich. The lemur vanished, releasing a powerful bloodthirst. It was something that Bugogan couldn't ignore, even with an enemy right in front of him. The more powerful their warrior, the more sensitive to bloodthirst he would be and the more his body would react automatically. And then the plan was to simply use mana bullets to turn him into a bee's nest. But Bugogan used super instant response once more to increase his reaction speed and put his huge, flexible upper body to use as he performed as Ord dance. This was a martial skill in which the user attacks in any direction. Bugogan attacked both behind him where the bloodthirst had come from, as well as the mana bullets coming from the front. Bugagagagagagagaga. The magic sword that gleamed as it reflected the moonlight flashed in every direction. It even looked beautiful as it cut the black spheres of mana into pieces. And then Vandali felt a premonition of his own death. He quickly thickened his impact negating barrier. Gaga. Bugogan pointed his magic sword towards Vandali and released a piercing thrust. A few millimeters further, and Vandali would have touched the cold blade. The thrust was so fast that Vandali would never have reacted in time if it hadn't been for his danger sense, death. Bugogan was able to deal with the bloodthirst of a lemur and the mana bullet simultaneously, while also launching an attack. Bugogan's strength in battle exceeded Vandali's expectations. Now that it's come to this, what killing methods do I have? Release pathogens into the air with incurable disease spell? Rejected? It would take time for the disease to infect Bugogan and produce symptoms. Vandali would run out of mana before then. Create poison with the deadly poison spell and then administer it to Bugogan? How? The simplest method would be to somehow inflict a wound and then apply the poison onto it, but it was difficult to inflict that wound in the first place. Distract him with golems? Vandali decided to give it a try. Bugogan clicked his tongue and pulled back his magic sword. Before he could attack again, Vandali used flight her fall back while whispering, get up. GCI. Earth golems rose from behind, wood golems rose from the debris scattered around the area, and the fallen goblin and kobold corpses rose as living dead. At the same time, Vandali turned the ground beneath Bugogan's feet into earth golems to destroy his footing and even released a lemur's bloodthirst and unleashed mana bullet simultaneously. Bugger. Bugogan chased after Vandali. He cut the golems and mana bullets down with his word dance while using kicking strike to crush the golems under his feet. Bugogan released a kicking strike with each step he took. Was he not afraid that the ground he was standing on would collapse? The ground shook with a loud thud each time his feet contacted the ground. Just as Vandali wondered whether this would become a contest of who would run out of stamina and mana first, he heard the voices of his allies. Fire. Botchan. Suddenly, arrows and spears, poison breath, spirit form feathers, arrows of fire and stone, and attacks of ice and wind all rained down on Bugogan. It seemed that Zadaris and the rest had arrived. Goa. Bugogan repelled these attacks with his extravagant armor, tough muscles and his magic sword. His magic sword even scattered the magic and poison breath attacks. He wasn't unharmed, but he had only taken damage on the level of superficial scratches. Not good. This situation is not good. Everyone had arrived at the scene, and they still had no way of dealing the decisive blow. Bugogan was fixated on killing Vandali for some reason, but would he give chase if Vandali were to run? No. In the worst-case scenario, Bugogan would simply target everyone else instead. Those targeted by him would have no way to survive. I can't let everyone be killed. Vandali might be able to have them stay in this world as spirits like Darsa. Sam and the other undead might be fine as long as their souls were intact and he just repaired the bodies that contained them. But what if that magic sword had the ability to cut through spirit forms? No way, definitely not. He couldn't allow that to happen. He couldn't let any of that happen. He had to kill this guy before that. But how would he kill Bugogan? How could he get past this ridiculous defense to inflict a fatal wound? Vandali thought so hard that steam might start rising from his head, and then he came to a sudden realization. He thought of something that Bugogan could neither evade nor block. It was simple. It was nothing special. He just needed to take a fatal wound himself. Vandali deliberately made his impact negating Barry thinner. And then Bugogan's magic sword pierced through it and landed a diagonal slash on Vandali's torso. Though Vandali wasn't aware of this, Bugogan seemed to be on the offense, but he wasn't in a comfortable position. In fact, from Bugogan's point of view, he was the one being driven into a corner. The unknown foe before his eyes gave off no presence whatsoever and unleashed lethal attacks one after another with no signs of bloodthirst. Each of the mana bullets that Vandali was freely releasing contained at least as much as the entire mana pool of the average first-class mage. Their power was lessened by the fact that his control over his mana was imperfect, but they were still powerful enough that if Bugogan took a direct hit, his bones would be smashed and several of his organs would rupture. In fact, every time Bugogan deflected one with his magic sword, his arms received an impact that he couldn't completely shake off and placed a heavy burden on his wrists that he couldn't ignore. How much longer could he endure these attacks? And on top of that, there were unknown invisible enemies releasing a bloodthirst, the ground surface and debris nearby had begun to move and corpses had risen up as undead. Even if he wanted to use magic to deal with these, there was a strange black substance surrounding him that prevented his mana from manifesting outside his body, making it impossible to cast spells. He had no choice but to simply use consecutive martial skills, mustering all his mana, stamina and more importantly his willpower and emotional strength to deal with this and execute his own counterattack. But then the enemy's reinforcements arrived. It was such a desperate situation that Bugogan wanted to shout, "You've got to be kidding me." Of course, aiming at any enemy but Vandali or trying to make an escape were both out of the question. If he let this enemy out of his sight, how would he block the summoner bullets? Because Vandali was erasing his presence completely, Bugogan could lose sight of him even if he focused on him. If he turned his back on Vandali, he would take a direct hit from a final mana bullet and die. What Bugogan thought was most terrifying about Vandali was that expression. The motionless eyes that watched him. They looked incredibly inhuman and showed no emotion. Not fatigue, fear, impatience or anything else. Seeing that, Bugogan thought that Vandali was composed. Didn't this guy look as if he could continue fighting for another whole hour, or even another whole day? If Bugogan didn't land an effective blow now, wouldn't he run out of strength and be killed? Bugogan could see his own defeat and death. Bugger. Believing that he was being driven into a corner one-sidedly, Bugogan thought that his only way to survive was to somehow kill Vandali, use what was left of his stamina to scatter the ghouls and then make an escape. And then one of his countless attacks reached Vandali's body. It wasn't deep enough to slice Vandali's torso in half. But as Bugogan felt the sensation of his blade cutting through Vandali's ribs and sternum to reach his organs, he involuntarily gave an unpleasant sneer. Van? Boy. Hearing the ghoul's screams, Bgogan was confident in his victory. He had expended most of his stamina and mana, but he still had a quarter of each left. That was plenty to scatter these inferior creatures. If he could, he would have wanted to slaughter them all, but that would have to come later. As long as he survived here, he would be able to build another kingdom. He would gather more subordinates and slaves and create more sons. This time for sure, he would create the strongest kingdom. Licking the incredibly warm blood that had sprayed onto his face, Bgogan fell to his knees. Looks like it worked. My blood spraying conveniently like that helped a lot. Vandali was on the ground, unable to breathe because his lungs had been cut. So he lay there silently, healing his own wound while watching Bgogan, who was on his knees. The moment he was cut, he had used spirit form transformation to transform his heart and spine into spirit form. Because his back was intact, his arms and legs could still move. It was a harsh sensation, as he was bleeding a lot, but he wouldn't die as long as he didn't asphyxiate. In order to close his wounds, he poured hundreds of thousands of mana into the no-attribute magic spell, Fortify Regeneration, with the mending of his lungs as the highest priority. He was fortunate that Bgogan's weapon had been an incredibly sharp magic sword. Because the wound was a clean cut, it was easy to heal. Cough. Boy, do not move. I will treat you right now. I'll take revenge for Vandali on this pig. Wait, I was just spitting out the blood that had gotten into my trachea. I'll be able to breathe again in a few minutes. And Vigoro, I'm not dead. Botchan, only we can hear your communication through thoughts. I do know that. Sam, what is Van saying? Everyone, everything is fine. Botchan's wounds will heal momentarily. The plan that Vandali had executed was to receive a deep wound that he could manage to heal on his own, while using deadly poison to turn the blood that sprayed from that wound into a toxic substance, and apply the toxic blood onto Bgogan. Bgogan hadn't expected that his enemy's blood would have turned into poison. He had been showered in Vandali's blood that had transformed into a poison so potent that it would permeate through the skin, and even licked it with his tongue and swallowed it. His arms and legs began convulsing, his vision blurred, he lost consciousness and then had a heart attack. Under the effects of this incredibly deadly, poisonous blood, Bgogan couldn't even maintain his grip on his magic sword. He fell to his knees and then crumpled onto the ground. First, the finishing blow must be dealt to that noble orc. And be careful not to come into contact with Botchan's blood dash. Vigoro? This should have been left to us, as we are unaffected by poison. Very well, please excuse me. Sam's carriage wheel ran over the fallen Bgogan's neck with a crunch. And so he brought an end to the noble orc Bgogan, who had been burning with ambition, but perished without any honor or proud achievements to his name. The battle between the Ghoul King and the noble orc, who had both overestimated each other's strength, came to an unsightly end. The battle was over, but there was still work to be done. Now that I think about it, someone did say that the hardest part would come after the battle. Dealing with the aftermath of war, so to speak. The first thing that needed to be done was, of course, casting Toxification and Vigoro to negate the poison in his body. To prevent monsters that might be attracted by the smell of the large amount of blood spilled in the ruins of the village, ghouls that had a relatively large amount of stamina remaining were stationed as lookouts. The ghoul women were in charge of caring for the ones that had been kept captive. They searched the buildings that were still intact to check whether there were any survivors. And then they had to prepare bedding to sleep in tonight. There was enough work to make their heads spin. Even Vandali, who had sent Bonebird back to the ghoul village as a messenger, only had 20% of his stamina and mana remaining. But he wasn't resting, either. There's a full-bodied richness to it, and yet there is a persistent aftertaste that lingers in the throat. Fortunately, there was plenty of food lying on the ground all over the village. Vandali was draining the blood out of the orc meat, and drinking it while he was at it, replenishing his stamina and mana. The outer wall made of int materials had reverted to simply being logs. Tomorrow, the task of turning them back into golems would be waiting for Vandali, though there was something even harsher waiting for him as well. Boy, we are busy right now, so I will leave it until later, but there is something I want to say. Zadyrus, me too. Bastia, I suspect that Dasa-sama also has something to say. She simply cannot remain silent about what happened today, after all. Sam, alright. Vandali, the plan of allowing his enemy to cut through his own flesh, organs and bones in order to dish out his blood as poison had succeeded, but it had made Zadyrus, among others, very angry. To be honest, it's scary when people get angry at me, so I don't like it, but Vigoro hadn't been angered after finding out about Vandali's plan. Instead, he had complimented Vandali by saying, Vandali is brave. Now that's what I call a real man. So Vandali managed to comfort himself, telling himself that it might not be so bad. Vandali, we will leave the remonstrations for tomorrow, so I wish to consult you regarding what to do with the human women. We ask them not to say anything about what happened and then release them near the town. This isn't a situation where we can do that, is it? Even if we were to release them near the town, they are in a state where they would likely sit there in the same spot until they die. I see. It seemed that there would be no happy ending where everyone would live happily ever after, even after the evil monsters had been defeated. Name, Gogan. Rank, 7 race, noble orc. Level, 100. Passive skills, superhuman strength, level 4. Endless sexual stamina, level 3. Lower race domination, level 3. Active skills, swordsmanship, level 6. Unarmed fighting technique, level 5. Armor technique, level 5. Earth attribute magic, level 4. Fire attribute magic, level 3. No attribute magic, level 2. Mana control, level 3. Chapter 22, During the aftermath of war, the number of followers increases. The woman lay on the bed like a living corpse, staring at the ceiling. I suppose it should be over now? To say that she was like a living corpse is not merely a simile, but reality. This woman was something known as a live dead, a freshly deceased corpse that had vitality forcibly poured into it to restart its heartbeat and respiration. It was the familiar of the degenerate adventurer Luciliano, who had made use of the orc's strong urge to reproduce to keep an eye on the noble orc's movements. The live dead's 5 senses were not very sensitive, so its sense of hearing was primarily used for gathering information. The sounds of swords clashing, war cries and dying screams coming from outside had stopped. The ghouls put up more of a fight than I would have imagined. Doesn't this mean that we don't have to gather a large group to exterminate them? There had been a group of over 500 monsters living in this village. That was while Luciliano's employer, Viscount Balches, needed to put himself at the mercy of Earl Palpapek, a marshal of the Mage nation, to gather a large-scale extermination force. However, if the battle with the ghouls reduced the orcs' numbers by a third, hiring 10 class adventurer parties would be enough. The orc messenger had brought the news that all of Gogan's sons and most of the higher-ranked leaders like the orc generals and orc mages had been defeated, and his ridiculously loud voice had reached the ears of the live dead. If that's the case, the only enemy that would pose a threat to class adventurers would be Gogan, and even he was only rank 7. That was the same rank as an earth dragon, but he was still a foe that could be defeated if class adventurers formed a party and fought him together. Hiring those class adventurers wouldn't be cheap, but far more affordable than gathering an extermination force of hundreds. Even if they suffered casualties, losing a few hired hands wouldn't be a problem, unlike losing soldiers and knights. That was what Luciliano was thinking, but his thoughts were interrupted as something entered the house that had been destroyed by its owner in rage. The footsteps were too quiet for it to be Gogan returning after his victory, and there were multiple of them. Were they goblins who had become lost in the confusion of the battle? There it is, it's a human. Is this thing alive? But the creatures that appeared were the lion-headed ghouls. Luciliano opened his eyes wide in surprise. It can't be, the ghouls won against the noble orcs. Luciliano had heard that there were no superior ghouls like ghoul tyrants or ghoul elder mages in this devil's nest. The ghouls defeating the noble orcs was a result that he had never expected. No, Luciliano wasn't the only one. Nobody would have thought it possible for a group of several hundred monsters ruled by a noble orc to be annihilated in an internal conflict within the Devil's Nest. However, no matter how hard it was to believe, the ghouls did not disappear from Luciliano's sight. It moved a little just now. It's alive. Male ghoul. All right, let's take it to where the other humans are. Male ghoul. Wait, at least cover her body before carrying her. Female ghoul. A ghoul woman appeared from behind the 2 ghoul men as well. She covered the body of the live dead that was still naked after being abandoned by Gogan mid-rape, using the furs from the bed. Luciliano watched this act of consideration with cold eyes. Now that the ghouls have won, rescuing the captive women is impossible. The fact that ghouls ate human flesh was common knowledge for everyone, not just adventurers. There was no doubt that the ghouls would now use the human women captured by the orcs as food for a feast to celebrate their victory. Or perhaps they would use the ritual to turn them into ghouls, but either way, saving them was now impossible. Well, considering how things would go for them even if they were rescued, I am sure that they would be happier being killed here. They were victims who had been defiled by orcs. Luciliano knew that there was a high chance that they would never be happy even after they were rescued. After even a month of being held captive by the orcs, they would have suffered deep scars not only in their bodies but also in their minds from the orcs' terrifying sexual desires and rough treatment. It would be difficult for them to recover on their own. In that state, it would probably be impossible for them to be adventurers again, and even if they wanted to, their equipment had all been taken by the orcs. It might not be so bad if they had funds saved at the guild, but the captured female adventurers were all D-class. They were unlikely to have enough savings to buy new equipment. Even if they gave up and retired, they would be considered filthy and never receive marriage proposals if people found out that they had been defiled by orcs, and even finding normal employment would be difficult. If they were normal village girls, then they could still rely on aid from the government. From Luciliano's point of view, Viscount Balches was fair as a nobleman. He probably wouldn't look after them for their whole lives, but he would at least support them for a year or two. But these women had been adventurers. People chose to be adventurers at their own risk, and whatever happened to them was their own responsibility. The prospect of receiving aid from the government was dim. At best, they might receive a month's worth of living expenses. Heroes saving women captured by monsters and living happily ever after was something that only happened in fairy tales. Of course, it was still better than it had been in the past where they might have been executed as witches who let monsters use their wombs or treated as spoils of war by the adventurers and sold to slave traders. As Luciliano pondered the uncertainties of the world, the ghouls began carrying his live-dead away. It would likely be eaten in the near future, but fortunately, the live-dead had no sense of pain so Luciliano wouldn't have to suffer. That was why he intended to get as much information as possible before the live-dead was destroyed. The ground outside is covered in orc, kobold and goblin corpses. But I don't see any ghoul corpses. Luciliano, who hadn't been watching the battle, had little idea of what had happened outside. In order to compensate for that now, he moved the live-dead's eyes around to investigate the surroundings, but all he saw was information that would put his employer, Viscount Balches, and Earl Palpapek in a dark mood. As far as he could see, the ghouls hadn't sustained any significant losses, and there were over 100 of them. And for some reason, every ghoul was well equipped and some were holding weapons that seemed to be magic items. This is all thanks to the king. The strongest king of all. The one who defeated the noble orc boss one-on-one. Long live the ghoul king. Long live Vandali. And then Luciliano heard the ghouls shouting these words in excitement over their victory. In summary, a ghoul king possessing outstanding leadership and commanding skills had appeared, with a way of supplying the ghouls with equipment far better than the average soldier, and he had even defeated a rank 7 monster in one-on-one combat. If this live-dead is destroyed, I'm going to refuse doing any more of this work even if I have to get on my knees and beg. Luciliano would definitely refuse getting involved in a battle against over 100 ghouls led by such a king. No matter how many gold coins he was paid, he couldn't use them if he were to die. He suddenly realized that the village's outer wall had disappeared, and its logs were now rolling around on the ground here and there. Was this the Ghoul King's doing, too? But I did hear that the title of Ghoul King is only held when multiple ghoul villagers form an alliance. The live-dead was gently put down on the floor of a relatively undamaged building. Wait here. Vandali will be here soon. With those words, the ghoul that had been carrying the live-dead left. The fact that he wasn't staying to keep an eye on the live-dead was likely because the ghoul didn't even consider it an enemy. Well, for ghouls, this live-dead is food rather than an enemy. Over a dozen women had been gathered here. They were all human, all of them had dead-looking eyes and bruises on their limbs and faces. RRNNH no, you ahika, kill me please kill me already. Even Luciliano, who was sometimes referred to by his title of degenerate, wanted to block his ears as he heard the sobbing and lifeless whispers. It seemed that these were indeed the female adventurers that had been held captive. As adventurers, they should have been both mentally and physically tough compared to the average woman, but they had been utterly broken. Luciliano didn't want to see them being eaten alive, so he hoped that they would be killed quickly first. As he was thinking this, he was suddenly startled. He just noticed a child in his vision that was staring at him. The odd-colored crimson and bluish-purple eyes gazed at him intently. The child was very young, not more than 3 years old. What was it doing in a place like this? Is this thing a damp? What is a damp child doing here? Where are its parents? There were no vampires among the noble orc's subordinates. Could it be on the ghoul's side? These questions ran through Luciliano's mind. But the damp child's words blew all of them away. Why are you inside there? That's someone else's body, isn't it? He can see that this is a lived dead? That's impossible, my technique isn't something that can be seen through so easily. The damper drew closer to the astonished Luciliano. The spirit of that woman is right beside you. She's telling you to give back her body and stop defiling her. He can see spirits, he's a spiritualist. Luciliano was an outstanding life attribute mage, but as he didn't possess the job of spiritualist, he couldn't see spirits. That was why he had never noticed the spirit of the corpse that he had used to create this live dead floating beside him. Luciliano gave up on trying to keep himself hidden. But he still had some room to work with. He was using magic to borrow this live dead's senses. He wasn't in this place himself. By bringing his consciousness back, Luciliano could escape from this devil's nest. It was no concern to him at all what this damper did with the live dead after that. Please don't run away. However, the damp's hand plunged into the live dead's body. That cold hand grabbed hold of Luciliano's consciousness. Gah? What did you do? Luciliano tried to return his consciousness back to his real body, but for some reason, he couldn't. He let out a scream at this feeling of pressure and discomfort. Could I ask you to answer my questions? Luciliano tried to resist without responding, but since his consciousness was transferred to this live dead right now instead of his original body, he couldn't use magic properly. I am an adventurer. I used this live dead to investigate this orc village. With the dangerous sense of not knowing what would happen to him, Luciliano decided to confess. Please tell me all the details. Vandali learned a lot from Luciliano. The lord of this region, Viscount Balches, and Earl Palpapek, who was a marshal of the Mage nation, had already discovered the existence of Bgogan's large village and his ambition of attacking the town. There were already movements to organize a large-scale extermination force under Earl Palpapek's leadership. Hearing this, Vandali felt a headache coming on. He had thought that the ghouls could keep living in the Devil's Nest without a problem once they eliminated the noble orcs. Once the orcs were eliminated, the ones standing at the top of the food chain in this Devil's Nest would, of course, be Zadyrus and the other ghouls. However, the humans had learned of the threat that Bgogan posed, and that information had even made its way to their upper echelons. Now that they were planning to send a large extermination force, Vandali's helps came crashing down. Would the Marshal cancel that plan if he knew? Force, Vandali's helps came crashing down. Would the Marshal cancel that plan if he knew that the noble orcs village has been annihilated? In response to this question, Luciliano hardened the live dead's face in silence for a moment, and then answered as if giving up. I am just an adventurer. I do not give orders or make decisions. But I do not think that the Marshal would cancel his plans. Vandali sighed. It was just as he thought. The noble orcs that had posed a direct threat to human society had been destroyed today. Their orc subordinates that were mainly orc generals and mages had all been killed, and even if a few orcs or slave goblins and kobolds had escaped, they weren't much of a threat. However, from the perspective of the Marshal and Viscount Balches who ruled this region, all that had changed was that the threat was now ghouls instead of orcs. It was a large army of ghouls that had destroyed a group of over 500 monsters, including multiple rank 6 noble orcs, led by a ghoul king. Who was to say that these ghouls wouldn't be a menace to human society? Since ghouls and orcs were both monsters to humans, the mere existence of a group of hundreds of monsters in a devil's nest only 3 days' journey away from the town was a threat to them. And if it became known that a damp was among that group of ghouls, there was a high chance that the Church of Alga would intervene. More specifically, a clergyman specialized in dealing with vampires, like High Priest Golden. That might be a chance for Vandali to kill High Priest Golden, the killer of his mother. But he still didn't have the confidence to say that he had the power needed to do so. While he did burn Dasa at the stake, Golden apparently had strength equivalent to a B-class adventurer. If that was true, then if he were to fight one-on-one against a rank 7 monster like Bgogan, he would almost certainly win without having to use a clever scheme like Vandali's one to allow his own flesh and organs to be cut. So Vandali wouldn't be able to defeat him unless he got extremely lucky. And luck was the one thing that he lacked the most. That's why he didn't hesitate to let this chance slip by. In fact, he proactively wanted to avoid it. But I have no way of avoiding it. His face, including the odd-colored eyes that were the distinguishing characteristic of dampers, had been clearly seen by Luciliano. He had only temporarily transferred his consciousness to this live dead to borrow its 5 senses. His real body was in a distant town. Vandali had no way of preventing him from talking. Luciliano had earnestly spat out the information that Vandali wanted to know out of fear of being unable to escape and not knowing what could happen to him, but the most Vandali could do was prevent his consciousness from returning from the live-dead to his real body. And even that required Vandali to constantly have his arms under spirit form transformation plunged into the live-dead, so he couldn't keep this up for hours. It was completely impossible for him to continue holding Luciliano inside the live-dead without sleep or rest until Luciliano's real body died of starvation. With that being the case, the remaining options were to appeal to Luciliano's emotions, bribe him or threaten him into silence. Vandali dismissed the option of appealing to his emotions. He didn't know what kind of human Luciliano was, but even if he was a kind-hearted person, he had been doing this because he had accepted a request for it. If he were to keep quiet about Vandali and the ghouls and then they were discovered later, the Adventurers Guild would do more than simply punish him. He would likely have a bounty put on his head. He probably wouldn't agree to put himself in that danger. Vandali also dismissed the option of bribery. No matter what Vandali promised Luciliano, he would find the legitimate payment that he received from the nobleman who was hiring him to be more desirable. The last option was to threaten him, but this wasn't effective, either. Luciliano was afraid of Vandali for now, but once he returned to his own body, Vandali wouldn't be able to lay a hand on him. Threatening him with only words was possible, but Vandali was convinced that this would only have the opposite effect. What kind of adult would be scared by the threats of a child who's less than 3 years old? He was actually quite scared due to his appearance and the aura around him. However, having decided that preventing his existence being known to the humans would be impossible, Vandali returned to his first question. I understand why you're inside this human. So, did you kill this person? This live-dead looked young, and quite healthy considering that it had been held captive by the orcs. There were no signs of a fatal wound having been treated, either. Vandali could only imagine that she had been deliberately killed. Did you kill this woman for the purpose of creating this live-dead? Realizing that this was the question being asked, Luciliano shook his head. No, I only transformed a corpse prepared by the Viscount into a live-dead. This woman, I don't know how she died. What this guy is saying, is it true? Vandali asked this question to the original owner of this live-dead's body, but she only replied with my body was stolen and give my body back. Don't defile it anymore ! He couldn't get a definitive answer. It seemed that over a month had passed since she died, and during that time, she had watched her own body being raped by Bogogan over and over. Vandali couldn't blame her for being in this broken state. I understand. I will let you go for now. But the next time I see you, I will kill you! As Vandali released the grip of his hand, Luciliano's consciousness quickly left the live-dead. The terrified expression disappeared from the live-dead's face and it became completely motionless. Vandali thought that it had returned to being a corpse, but it was still breathing and its heart was still beating. It would likely stay as a live-dead until the mana that had been put into it ran out, even after its owner left the body. Thank you, I was able to get my body back. You're welcome. What will you do from now? From now? I'm already dead, so from now don't you want to be reborn? Eh? What do you mean by that? Everyone who dies will one day be granted a new life by a god and be reborn. It seemed that the concept of the circle of transmigration existed in Lambda. Rodcourt's name wasn't known, but everyone knew about the idea that the souls of the dead would one day be born anew. So of course, she considered it common sense that if she left this world and entered the afterlife, she would be reborn one day. She was wondering why Vandali felt the need to even ask her this question. What I'm trying to say is, do you not want to be reborn and have a new life right now? Right now? Is something like that possible? Yes. I can't bring you back to life. But fortunately, there is a new life inside you. Vandali had noticed the presence of a tiny life that couldn't even be called a fetus yet inside the live-dead lying limp on the floor. He was asking her if she was willing to reside inside that and be reborn. You're telling me to become an orc? The woman's spirit was friendly towards Vandali because of the effects of the death attribute charm and the fact that he had recovered her body, but she still had to refuse Vandali's suggestion. Even though she had already died, it would be torture for her to be reborn as the child of the one who had raped her body, an orc, no less. In fact, if Vandali had simply asked her, would you like to go to the afterlife or be reborn as an orc right now? Her immediate choice would have been to go to the afterlife. It's alright, I will remove as many of the orc genes as I can. You won't become an orc. You can do something like that? If there's any orc blood in a child, that child will definitely become an orc, you know? I can do it. I have a little experience with this. However, Vandali had experience in the selective breeding of animals, plants and humans. To be more accurate, he knew that he could do this with death attribute magic. Among the experiments in Origin, there had been research to see whether it was possible to use death attribute magic to kill off certain parts of certain genes, resulting in selective breeding. And these experiments had succeeded. He had killed the horse genes in a half-donkey, half-horse mule fetus to produce a foal that was purely a donkey. Seeds that were resistant to disease and cold but weak to heat, and seeds that were resistant to heat but weak to disease were bred together, and then Vandali had cut the unnecessary parts out of the genes of the resulting offspring to produce seeds that were resistant to disease, cold and heat. He had performed the same thing in domestic animals and human zygotes that had been produced by the sperm and eggs of people of different races, with a success rate of over 90%. Thanks to these experiments, the military nation that owned the laboratory that Vandali was held captive in developed its agriculture and animal breeding and overcame a large number of hereditary diseases, becoming renowned as a great country for medical care. I'm not sure that things went so well for them after I died, though. Holding back this dark thought in his chest, Vandali continued to explain the process to the woman's spirit to ease her mind about it. The perfect time is just before or just after the egg cell has been fertilized, but it has already been some time since it attached itself to the womb, so I can't make you completely human. But I should be able to make you close enough to a human that you would never be considered an orc. So that means I become like a beast person? I've never seen a beast person, so I can't say for sure. The woman's spirit fell silent. She seemed to be deep in thought. Vandali simply waited until she came to an answer. He wasn't helping her purely out of his own goodwill. It would be convenient for him if she chose this rebirth. Vandali's goal was revenge, to survive against the cheaters who would be reincarnated in this world, and to revive his mother, Dasa. One of the methods he had thought of for that last goal was to have Dasa possess a fertilized egg, as they had a high affinity for spirits, to have her undergo a pseudo-reincarnation. But it was best to have as many cards in his hand as possible. There was no guarantee that the process would go well in Lambda as it had in Origin. He didn't know whether creatures in this world even had genes and DNA, and even if they did, they might not have the same structure as the creatures in Origin. He was intending to use this woman as an experimental subject to find out. That was why Vandali simply waited as she contemplated the choice. If he told her his circumstances, the death attribute charm skills effect would force her to nod her head. But that didn't mean that he wanted to lie to her, either. How hypocritical. Vandali himself was aware that it to lie to her, either. How hypocritical. Vandali himself was aware that it was hypocritical. That was why he thought that if she agreed to do this, no matter what the result, it would still be true that he had helped her with her new life. I have made my decision. Please allow me to be reborn. I understand. I will do everything I can. He used spirit form transformation in his arms once more and buried them in the live dead's abdomen. And then he poured mana into the fetus smaller than the tip of his pinky finger that was living inside the womb, determining its current state. He could sense almost no human genes in the fetus. The genes were mostly those of an orc, and if the child was born now, it would certainly be a noble orc. As Vandali had guessed before, the reproduction of orcs and noble orcs was different from normal creatures. The orc's genes absorbed the mother's genes as the child developed. With that being the case, he simply had to reverse that relationship. He weakened the noble orc's genes with death attribute mana and stopped the weakening of the human genes, stimulating them to become stronger. If he just stopped the fetus from dying now, it would grow into a mostly human child. I'm glad I learned the mana control skill. Doing this without any kind of scientific equipment was very difficult. This wasn't something that could be done by simply pushing his mana through by force. If he did that, this fragile fetus would be destroyed. He had to delicately sort through the genes and apply the treatment to each cell, one by one. Well then, let's meet again. And then he had the spirit of the woman whose name he didn't know possess the fetus. That suddenly reminded him, there had been controversy on Earth over when someone possessed a soul. Did a person have a soul right at the moment of fertilization, from some point during the pregnancy as a fetus, or from the moment that he or she was born? In Lambda, in this particular case, this person possessed a soul starting right now, Vandali thought. It wasn't a particularly meaningful thought. And then he transferred additional mana to the living dead. Because he didn't know how much mana Luciliano had given to it, he had to prevent its heart from stopping before the woman was reborn. Now he had to decide what to do with the rest of the female adventurers. But, King, why are you so popular with women? Maybe it's the influence of my skills. From even before Vandali conducted his all-out cross-examination on Luciliano, the female adventurers had been clinging onto Vandali. Ah, please please, with the half-naked women clinging onto him. The ghouls who were just passing by assumed that Vandali was simply popular with the women, but the reality was quite different. The female adventurers were in a state where their minds had been broken and they were simply like living corpses with death as their only hope. To them, the death attribute mana around Vandali looked like a Shinigami's scythe that had come to grant them salvation. The death attribute charm was supposed to have no effect on the living, but it seemed that it did affect humans who truly desired death, even if they were still alive. As the women who were clearly not sane surrounded Vandali and silently begged him to kill them, he felt his own sanity being scraped away. His ability to concentrate had probably increased from not looking at the women clinging onto him as he talked to the woman's spirit and performed the genetic therapy earlier. However, no matter how much he averted his eyes from them, they wouldn't simply disappear. There were those waiting for the Ghoul King Vandali's decision on what to do. First, let's say that killing them is out of the question. For Vandali, the women were his enemies as they were adventurers of the Mage nation, but he couldn't bring himself to kill them when they were in this state. Releasing them near the city would dash. No. Don't, just kill me, please kill me. Not be a good idea, I see. Vandali wasn't familiar with how this world worked like Luciliano was, but he did understand that releasing the women in this state wouldn't be an act of salvation for them. He had thought that perhaps they would have families or lovers waiting for them in the town, but that didn't seem to be the case. They either didn't have special people, were on bad terms with their families, or perhaps their companions had been in their party when they came here and were killed by the orcs. Even so, caring for them in the ghoul village wasn't an option, either. They were currently under Vandali's charm, but there was no telling whether they would stay under it if they regained the will to live. In fact, it was likely that Vandali's skill would be rendered ineffective if that happened. They could regain their sanity and become enemy adventurers once more. Vandali pitied the female adventurers, but the safety of the ghouls still took priority. Well then, will you become ghouls? That was why it was only natural for Vandali to suggest this option. He had heard from Zadyrus before that a ritual could be performed to transform human women into ghouls. Terra was a living example of that. Become ghouls? Yes, and become my followers. Before Vandali finished speaking, light returned to the female adventurer's lifeless eyes. I'll become one. I'll become a ghoul, like carnivores with prey right in front of them, the piercing light in their pupils, pupils, all of them were smiling, but rather than looking as if they had found some new hope that would save them, they looked as if they had been broken beyond all recognition and transformed into completely different people. Me too, turn me into a ghoul. I'll become one too, make me your follower. And so all of the female adventurers chose to become ghouls, and the number of Vandali's followers increased by 13. It seems that the boy has successfully convinced those adventurers to become ghouls. Since we cannot return them to human society, the only other thing we can do is welcome them as our brethren. That's true, but there was one woman that he was unusually deep in conversation with. It looked like he was using magic, too. Zadyrus and Bazdia had come to tell Vandali that there was the option of transforming the female adventurers into ghouls, but they had ended up watching him from a short distance away. You are right. And that woman stopped moving right after their conversation, as if she had died. I suppose we should go and ask the boy to explain the situation once things have settled down. Zadyrus watched the female adventurers jostling around and extending their hands out towards Vandali like the dead gathering around the spider's thread that descended from paradise as she waited for them to calm down. Chapter 23 The truth I learn as I approach 3 years of age, and the enemy of my enemy is an enemy. It was a clear February morning, with the smell of blood on the cool morning breeze. A deep war cry echoed out. As ghouls who were busy removing the organs from orc, goblin and kobold corpses and preparing them for breakfast glanced at the source of the war cry in surprise, Vigoro looked up at the morning sun. Oi, hasn't Vigoro grown bigger? It can't be, he ranked up. Vigoro's body that was already over 2 meters tall to begin with had grown a size bigger. His lion's head was more masculine, his fangs were thicker and stronger, and the muscles of his limbs had grown larger while maintaining their flexibility. His appearance was that associated with individuals that were legendary to the ghouls, individuals who hadn't existed in this devil's nest for several hundred years. Berserker, a ghoul berserker. Vigoro had been a ghoul barbarian with long years of experience as a warrior. In last night's battle, he had defeated multiple orc generals that were of the same rank as him, as well as the noble orc that was a rank higher, earning him a large quantity of experience points. At the same time, the level of his skills had improved as well, so it seemed that he had met the requirements for his rank to increase. Though it wasn't as great as the legendary ghoul tyrants, the ghouls cheered and shouted Vigoro's name as they witnessed the birth of a ghoul berserker, who were said to be able to slaughter 100 human soldiers alone. 5 minutes later, Vandali was receiving remonstrations first thing in the morning from 3 beautiful women. Some might be jealous of him, but if one were to voice that to him, he would likely reply, in my profession at least, this isn't a reward. Listen, boy. You are indeed our leader, but that does not mean that you must take on the role of finishing the enemy's leader. It's true that I would have only been a hindrance in a fight against that noble orc, but you didn't have to suddenly fly out to face him on your own. If you had brought your allies and received their support from the beginning of the fight, then maybe you wouldn't have had to rely on such a dangerous plan, right? That's right, I thought I was going to faint when Sam told me what happened. Vandali, you're still a child who's not even 3 years old, that was going too far. Only Vandali could see and hear Dasa, who was scolding him the most, so Zedaris and Bazdia were under the impression that only the 2 of them were remonstrating him, however. Yes, I'm sorry. Making no excuses, Vandali sincerely apologized. Looking back on it, it was indeed reckless for him to charge at Bgogan on his own. There had to have been other ways. He had made Zedaris, Bazdia and, most of all, Dasa worry about him. As Bazdia said, if they had attacked Bgogan with everyone together from the beginning and used arrows, throwing weapons and magic attacks from a distance while Vandali slowed him down, it might have been possible to render Bgogan helpless, though it would have taken some time to finish him off. This method would have worked even better if Vandali had applied deadly poison to the ghouls' arrows and throwing weapons, too. And though it would have been difficult to prevent Bgogan from killing anyone, the risk of someone dying was probably not all that different from the risk of Vandali dying when he allowed Bgogan to cut through his ribs, sternum and lungs. After having a night to calmly think about it, Vandali had come to realize that other methods had been available to him. And though Vandali hadn't been aware of it at the time, he knew that he had lost his presence of mind back then. Well, that was only natural. It was his first real battle in a long time, and it was a large-scale battle, too. Vandali comforted himself by telling himself this as he prepared himself for long remonstrations. But this just shows how much you care about all of the ghouls, Vandali, so I will overlook it just this once. But don't do that again, okay? But it's also true that we weren't strong enough for you to have confidence in us. I actually fired arrows at the noble orc, but they were all cleared away by his magic sword. That can't even be called support. I couldn't create any openings. I'm sorry, Van. I made you do such a reckless thing because I'm still inexperienced. Indeed. And thanks to you, boy, we did not suffer even a single casualty. Because you distributed your magic items, strengthened us with your skills, transferred your mana to us and rendered the enemy mages helpless. If you consider these things, we had been demanding the unreasonable of you from the very beginning. I apologize, boy. However, though Vandali had expected them to be angrier at him, Dasa quickly forgave him while Bazdia and Zedaris even apologized in return. Vandali was shocked, but none of them took back their words. Is that all? As Vandali asked this question, the 3 of them blinked in surprise. Yes, you do not wish to be scolded any further either, do you, boy? Zedaris and the other 2 seemed surprised as to why he would ask this question, and Vandali replied without thinking, I don't, but the reprimanding I've faced up until now have been harsher and longer. In Vandali's past lives on Earth and in Lambda, he had never been blessed with old age. The uncle who had raised him on Earth always delivered his reprimanding with a set combo of violence and angry shouting. And since he was concerned about maintaining outward appearances, he had always waited until they came back home to do so. On top of that, he had never listened to Vandali's side of the story or tried to understand why things had happened as they did. He had never pointed out how Vandali should improve himself other than saying, don't ever do that again, and even after reprimanding Vandali, he had never thought about how he should prevent Vandali from repeating his behavior. And the reason for his reprimanding was, you parentless piece of shit. You're being a burden to me by trying to have the same luxuries as a normal person, you have to be censored, kidding me! So Vandali only felt anger and fear towards him, When his aunt had reprimanded him, it was just long. She would complain endlessly in a dark tone, not making any sense as she rambled on and on. She wouldn't stop until she was satisfied or needed to do something else. The worst was when she had said, "You've made me waste so much time on scolding you," and then spent the next few hours scolding him. The teachers of his school had scolded him without putting much thought or effort into it whenever some kind of trouble occurred. Rather than trying to think about who or what had caused the trouble, it was easier for them to blame it on the boy who was always acting suspiciously and dressed in old, black clothes. In fact, that was how his elementary school class had been kept in order, and Vandali had just assumed that this was just the correct way for the school to handle things. With those lessons in his mind, he succeeded in living a peaceful middle school and high school life, being as inconspicuous as air. And then in Origin, being scolded had changed meaning to become being punished. In Origin, Vandali had been a mere laboratory animal, and for the researchers who raised him, he was something that needed to be trained, not educated. Fists were replaced with electrical shocks and remonstrations were replaced with words that were like knives that gouged out his lungs. Of course, they had no reason to listen to Vandali's complaints, and the researchers always prioritized their own convenience first. Even though he obeyed all of their commands, there were times where he was punished for absurd reasons, like experiments where electricity was passed through his body, leaving him convulsing on the floor, to test whether his mana's properties would change if he was subjected to extreme pain. As a result of these traumatic experiences, Vandali had become extremely afraid of people becoming angry at him. If it was someone he didn't mind killing, someone he wanted to kill, someone he was able to kill, then that would be fine. He wasn't scared of fighting and killing. But he was scared of those he couldn't kill becoming angry at him and reprimanding him. Of course, he hadn't thought for a moment that Darsa, Zadiris or Bazdia would act like his uncle or those researchers. But even so, he had been terrified. "Vandali, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry for scaring you." Darsa had a rough idea about Vandali's past and what he had been through. She didn't have a physical body, but she wrapped her cold, spirit arms around him gently. "No, it's nothing you need to apologize for, Mom. It was a trauma that he had from his previous lives. It would have been unfair to expect Darsa to make an effort to be cautious about it. She was the first mother in this world to raise a child with memories of his previous lives, so there were no examples for her to follow." However, as the other two were unaware that Vandali possessed memories from his previous lives, they could only make the incorrect assumption. "Boy, I have never heard details regarding your mother. What kind of person was she? I mean, normally, what was she like? And how did she act when she was angry at you, Van?" Their eyes were sympathetic and their words were inarticulate. Seeing this, Vandali realized that they were thinking that his mother had abused him. "No, that's not it. It wasn't my mother. This is the perfect opportunity, so I'll tell you about my circumstances. Could I call Figaro here? Vandali, you don't need to worry about me. They can't see me, after all. I do worry about it. You being misunderstood makes me sad as well, Mom." Vandali didn't want Zadiris or anyone else having the wrong impression of Darsa, and he had been planning to tell them about his circumstances anyway, so he decided to take this opportunity to tell them everything. "I see, so that's what." The fact that Vandali possessed memories from his previous life and the one before that, and the fact that he had lived those lives in other worlds. The fact that 100 people with abilities that surpassed common sense, abilities that Vandali didn't have, would be reincarnating in this world in the future. When Vandali told these facts to Zadiris and the others, they were surprised and, for some reason, they seemed to understand. It was better than them not believing him, but Vandali was bewildered that they believed him so easily, so they explained why. "You are a child who possesses 100 million mana and uses death attribute magic, something that has never existed before in this world. Even considering the fact that you are a damper, having such an unbelievable past actually makes this more believable. And you know too many things considering that you're not even 3 years old, Van. That would be the case even if Sam and the others were to teach you things. It makes sense if all of that knowledge is from your previous lives. Yeah, it's just like those two said. I have nothing more to say to that. Now that you mention it, that makes sense to me, too. Well, it is still a surprise that there will be 100 more people like you, boy. 100 people with over 100 million mana, huh? Zadiris and Bazdia looked deep in thought with grave expressions on their faces as they imagined young men and women with 100 million mana becoming adventurers or knights and mages under the employment of human nations. But Vandali shook his head. "No, I think they will have much less mana than me." "What? Is that so?" "Yes. The reason I have this much mana is because I don't have anything else. Other than Vandali, Rodcorti had granted the 100 reincarnated people cheat-like abilities and affinities for different attributes of magic. Vandali's abnormal amount of mana was compensation for his lack of those things. Rodcorti had explained that Vandali's empty frame would store large quantities of mana, but looking at it another way, this meant that the others didn't possess Thai's empty frame. Their frames had been filled with cheat-like abilities and different attributes of magic. There was no way that they could have an empty frame. Most of them would probably have slightly more than the 10,000 mana that first-rate mages of Lambda would have. As Vandali said this, Zadiris and Basdia let out a sigh of relief. I see, that is reassuring to hear. But still, they have cheat-like abilities, you know. I do not know what exactly this cheat-like abilities might be, but the fact that you have 100 million mana is already beyond the bounds of common sense, boy. As Zadiris said, the mages of this world that could be called first-rate would have maybe slightly over 10,000 mana. Even enormous monsters who could defeat A-class or S-class adventurers that were known as superhumans might possess only 100,000 mana. 100 million mana was something that could be compared to the gods and the demon king that had existed in the age of the gods. Is that so? Well, if I could use magic of the normal attributes, then that might be the case. But the owner of that mana, Vandali, still only had a weak sense of how vast it really was. He was unable to use fire attribute or earth attribute magic that was easy to make use of in battle, and since his skill with mana control was insufficient, he spent at least several thousands of mana to cast one spell. He didn't feel like he could say that his own power was very cheat-like. You know, I think that it would be alright for you to have a little more confidence in yourself, Vandali. I'll do my best. Leaving that aside, I think that I might cause trouble for everyone if I stay as the Ghoul King. The guys who are going to be reincarnated here have only lived in worlds where humans are the only intelligent creatures, so I don't know how they'll act. The status screen and skills of this world were systems similar to those used by games on Earth and in Origin. They might decide to slaughter all monsters in sight, like one might do in a game. No, it would be fine if they slaughtered monsters. The problem was if they decided to do the same for the races created by Vida, which were designated as monsters by the Amid Empire. That went without saying for the ghouls who weren't even considered one of the races created by Vida. And if they were Vandali's friends, then there was a real chance that they would enthusiastically start trampling over the ghouls indiscriminately, even the women and children. Thinking about it rationally, Vandali and the other 100 reincarnated people weren't on hostile terms. Rodcorti's mistake and misfortune had aligned, resulting in Vandali's reincarnation in Origin to be unknown to the rest of them, and they had simply dealt him the finishing blow as he was in an undead state. However, after he had been finished off in Origin, Vandali had declared that he would slaughter them all, so he didn't know what would happen. Even if they were originally reincarnated together, if one were to be asked to be friends with someone who had shouted that he would kill them, even Vandali would shake his head. If Rodcorti was watching Vandali now and knew that his desire for revenge on them had disappeared, then it would be fine, but that hope was slim. It didn't seem like that God was even keeping a proper eye on the world of Origin that we were reincarnated into. If Rodcorti had been watching, he could have at least sent a message to Amamiya Hiroto and the others to save Vandali. Because he hadn't even done that, Vandali expected nothing from him. And so Vandali thought that he should give up his title now that he had destroyed the noble orc's large village, but Zadiris and the others thought otherwise. That might indeed be the case, but those 100 people should be reincarnated here in the order in which they die in that world called Origin, not all at once. Is that not right? In that case, then we are talking about something that will not happen for a long while, and each time they appear, they should not appear in large numbers. Am I wrong? When Vandali had been killed in Origin, they had looked to be in their early 20s. But they had been dispatched to exterminate an undead that had appeared in the military nation's secret laboratory. They seemed to have been doing dangerous work. So there was a chance that there were some who had made a mistake in their work and died half a year or a year after Vandali had. However, they had the protection of their affinity for different attributes of magic, good fortunes and destinies as well as their cheat-like abilities, all of the things that Vandali hadn't received. They wouldn't die so easily. And because of the magic that hadn't existed on Earth, science in Origin seemed to have been more advanced than on Earth. So unless they were killed or afflicted by serious illnesses such as cancer, they would live in Origin up until they were in their 80s or possibly even until they were over 100 years old. It was indeed still some time away. And it was difficult to imagine that there would be multiple people dying simultaneously. And there is nothing to suggest that all of those 100 people will be reborn in the Amid Empire and its nations. It could be that they are reborn in the country that you are intending to go to, beyond the mountain range, or even on another continent. There is no guarantee that they will be born to human parents. They could be born from the wombs of our schools or one of the other races created by Vida. Well, that might be the case, but what Zedorus was saying was reasonable, so Vandali had no response. And then Basdia dealt the final blow. And there are plenty of enemies that are threats to us other than those 100 people. If the humans were to dispatch B-class and A-class adventurers into this devil's nest, we could be destroyed. A high-rank monster from another devil's nest might come here and build its power, just like that noble orc. Those 100 people being reincarnated here doesn't give us a reason to be separated from you, Vandali. It was as Basdia said. The ghouls were the most powerful in this devil's nest. But if the Mage Nation seriously dispatched high-class adventurers, they wouldn't even be able to put up a fight. And if you weren't here, I don't know if we would have been able to win the battle against the orcs. Even if we did, we would still be unable to have babies and we wouldn't be able to maintain the village. It doesn't make sense to run away because you're scared of something that's going to happen decades from now. Well, that might be the case too, but this was reasonable too, so Vandali couldn't strongly deny it or make any points against it. For the ghouls, things that threatened their existence naturally existed, so it was the obvious choice to fight to survive the threats rather than try to avoid them, prepare for them rather than live in fear of them. And if you left us and then those 100 people starting hunting down monsters anyway, I think it would end up the same regardless. Considering that, it would be more reassuring to have you around, Van. ? I hadn't thought of that. Vandali was rendered speechless in surprise. The truth was that there was a high possibility of the reincarnated people hunting monsters on a large scale even if Vandali wasn't involved with them. After all, they were strong people, and in the world of Lambda, monsters were evil. They would very likely hunt monsters to satisfy their sense of justice or simply to quickly gain money and fame. Vandali was in shock, but surprisingly it was Vigoro whose decisive opinion changed Vandali's mind. I'm sure those guys are not even that strong to begin with, Vandali. Vigoro's words left Vandali dumbfounded. They would surely be strong. They would have power beyond all reason, they would be so strong that one would think it unfair. Those 100 people, not even that strong? Of course they're going to be strong. Definitely far stronger than me. But they can die, right? Then you will be able to kill them. Vigoro said this as if it was obvious, and Vandali reflexively began to object. There's no way that, And then he suddenly realized. That's right, they could definitely die. Rod Corti had granted those 100 people cheat-like ability. With the exception of Vandali. He protected them with good fortune. He guided them with a destiny. However, Rod Corti's goal was to use these people who had died on Earth to develop the world of Lambda. The only reason he had reincarnated them in Origin first was to have them gain experience. Things had been set up so that they would be reincarnated in Lambda as they died in Origin. It would be a problem if they couldn't die. If they didn't die in Origin, they would never be sent to Lambda. Therefore, among the cheat-like abilities granted to them by Rod Corti, there would be none that absolutely prevented them from dying or being killed. They might possess cheat-like abilities that granted them tremendous offensive abilities, but if their defensive abilities were normal, they could be killed. They might be able to move at ultra-high speeds, but they would die if made ill by an incurable disease spell. They might have rapid regeneration abilities that would let them regrow severed limbs, but if their brains and hearts were destroyed simultaneously, then they would die. They might have the ultimate defensive abilities, but if afflicted with aging, they would die of old age. None of these methods would be simple. It would be difficult, lives would have to be put on the line in these battles. But Vandali was a death attribute mage. He was someone who could freely use magic to bring about death, or keep it at a distance. As long as his enemies were living beings that would eventually die one day, there would definitely be a way for Vandali to kill them, and he should have a means to accomplish that. I wonder why I hadn't realized such a basic thing until now, Vandali. It is only natural to fear those who have what you do not have. Zedorus, and they killed you once, didn't they? I can't blame you for thinking that you can't win against them. Vigoro. Vandali fell to his knees as Zedorus and Vigoro correctly guessed the reasons he had feared those 100 people so much. I've been thinking about it since I was born, for almost 3 years, but I never thought of that. Because you pointed it out, I have more hope for the future. Thank you. Vandali. It helps us to be allies with you. Don't worry about it. Vigoro bared his fangs that were larger than they had been yesterday in a smile, looking as if he'd be satisfied as long as Vandali didn't bring up the idea of giving up the title of king again. Well, we might be a hindrance for you when you're trying to become an adventurer and nobleman. Vigoro, when that time comes, I'll tell people that I have tamed you. If that doesn't work, I'll pile up so many achievements that they can't ignore me. Vandali, oh, you've broken free, Van. Bastia, even he could kill those with the cheat-like abilities. As Vandali made this realization, his worries in life had been cut in half and his head felt clearer. He still aimed to kill enemies like High Priest Gordon and Hines, and he was confident that if he became stronger, he would be able to do it. Leaving Earth and Origin aside, he had skills in this world and even possessed 100 million mana. If he could master using this mana, his revenge and killing the cheaters would be possible. There were steep mountains and valleys ahead of him in life, but he felt as if they had become a little less steep. Feeling refreshed, Vandali remembered something that he had meant to say once the sun rose but hadn't said yet. Ah, I just remembered. The humans had been making preparations to exterminate the orc village, and now they've found out that we've already done it. What should we do? Boy, that is the more pressing concern. It seemed that the meeting would continue for some time. Luciliano was pale and feeling strained in the morning. That is the end of my report. He was on his knees, delivering a report to his employer, the mustached nobleman Berno Balches, and a row of knights. And there was a middle-aged man with a medium build in the prime years of his life sitting at the head of the table. Though Luciliano wasn't specialized in combat, he was an adventurer who had completed numerous requests from noblemen over the years. This man wasn't the kind of person whose presence should cause an adventurer like Luciliano to be feeling nervous. However, every time Luciliano stood before him, he felt his spine grow cold and experienced an unpleasant feeling of tension. That report is the truth, I presume? Yes, Marshal Palpapek. The man's name was Marshal Thomas Palpapek. He held the court rank of Earl, but that was the rank that he was given because this country of Mig was a nation of the Mid Empire. In the Empire, the title of Marquis was only held by royal family members of the Empire's nations. He was a capable marshal whose abilities and achievements were so great that if Mig were an independent nation instead of being a part of the Empire, it would not have been surprising for him to hold the rank of Marquis or even Duke. Since he had risen to this position, the Mig nation had withstood attacks from the Orborn Kingdom, public order had been improved and worked with adventurers to be involved in dealing with multiple large incidents in which monsters began overflowing from devil's nests. I see. The noble orcs have been annihilated and their subordinates have been scattered. That is extraordinarily delightful news, is it not, Marshal Dono? Viscount Balches looked truly happy as he smiled at Marshal Palpapek. It somehow seemed that even his prided handlebar moustache had become shinier. He was feeling relieved as there no longer seemed to be a need to spend large amounts of taxes to hire adventurers and dispatch soldiers and knights as an extermination force, causing casualties in the process. There was a strong stereotype of noblemen treating those serving them as being disposable, but the ones who did that without hesitation were fools. Those with some ability as noblemen avoided casualties where possible. Soldiers were needed to maintain the peace of a region, and if some of them died, they could not always be replaced immediately. It was different from temporarily hired soldiers and guards, who only needed to be provided with equipment. One should desire a certain level of skill and loyalty from regular soldiers. This was especially true for knights whose families had served noblemen for generations. If noblemen put the lives of knights to waste, they would be disgraced and lose favor from the knight families who would choose other masters. Losses should be kept low, even for soldiers recruited from the lower class populace. If the young people that were the able workers of society were to die in large numbers, the productivity of the region would fall and severe economic problems would develop. And there was nothing good about causing dissatisfaction amongst the people. Adventurers were a special case, as they worked in their occupation at their own risk. Even if 10 or 20 of them were lost, a town as large as Viscount Balches's wouldn't be negatively affected at all. Hundreds of adventurers died every year in the nation of Mig alone. Nobody would claim that this was the responsibility of the rulers. But this only applied on a national level. If a large number of adventurers in one region were to suddenly decrease in number by too much, the monster numbers in devil's nests would be less regulated and the materials that adventurers obtained from monsters would become scarcer. There would be consequences for anti-monster measures as well as economic consequences. And since adventurers were essentially wanderers, if there were rumors that a nobleman was forcing adventurers to accept unreasonable requests, they could simply turn away from that nobleman. That would cause long-term difficulties for the region. Therefore, it was best to eliminate or at least reduce casualties. Of course, there were some things that needed to be done even if casualties were certain to occur. Exterminating a noble orcs group of 500 monsters that was planning to attack the town, for instance. The group of monsters was gone, eliminating the need to form an extermination force. This could only be a good thing for Viscount Balches. He wasn't interested in things like having the honor of exterminating powerful monsters. However, it seemed that Marshal Palpapek thought differently. That cannot be said, Viscount Balches. Perhaps we should increase the size of the extermination force. No, more importantly, perhaps I should ask High Priest Gordon for his assistance in killing this vampire. Well, how can that be, Marshal? The noble orcs have already been killed. The danger has passed. The danger has not passed. It has simply changed, from orcs to ghouls. A group of ghouls that won a battle against a group of 500 monsters led by a noble orc. Though Luciliano has not confirmed this, there are likely ghoul mages. There is even a chance that there are higher class ones, like high mages or berserkers. Or would you suggest that such a group of monsters is not a threat? Marshal Palpapek was right. For humans, orcs and ghouls were both monsters. The only differences were that ghouls had females, so they didn't need to abduct human women so frequently, and they didn't often come out of the devil's nests. But these differences were enough for Viscount Balches's knights to disagree. But Marshal, there have never been any confirmed cases of ghouls acting outside devil's nests, let alone in a group. Is it not safe to assume that the ghouls will not come out of the devil's nest? In particular, the ghouls of the devil's nest do not even fight adventurers, they are relatively docile. And as the adventurer there reported, the monsters led by the noble orc were using the female ghouls as mothers, were they not? Is this incident not simply the ghouls taking revenge on the orcs? The ghouls that had the power to defeat the noble orcs and their subordinates were indeed threatening. However, it wasn't anything more than a struggle for existence that had occurred within the devil's nest. The conflict wouldn't spread outside. Why was there any need to take the effort to enter that conflict in a place that couldn't even be seen from here? Even Marshal Palpapek nodded, knowing that there was some truth to this argument. Indeed, if it is the ghouls that have been there for a long time, that would be the case. However, has there ever been a group of ghouls with a damp child among them? However, in response to this question, Viscount Balches and his knights could only say that they had never heard of such a thing. And considering the situation, it is highly likely that this damp is the Ghoul King, isn't that right? Yes. Considering the situation, I cannot deny the possibility of the damp being the Ghoul King Vandali. Luciliano, who had remained silent until now, offered his thoughts with a tone that implied that he wouldn't take responsibility if he was incorrect. The ghouls had said that Vandali was coming, and then the damp child had appeared. If one considered this, it could be reasonably deduced that that child was the one called Vandali. And the other ghouls had said that Vandali was the Ghoul King. In that case, then the Ghoul King was a damp child by the name of Vandali. Even though he was a damper, it was difficult to believe. Then the Ghoul King was a damp child by the name of Vandali. Even though he was a damper, it was difficult to believe an infant that could not even be called a boy yet was the king that led a pack of ghouls. But there was no basis for anyone to deny this possibility. And on top of that, Marshal Palpapek shared a piece of shocking information. Actually, I have a good idea of just who this damper named Vandali is. What? Is this true, Marshal? It seemed that even the knights serving Marshal Palpapek were hearing this for the first time. They were murmuring along with Viscount Balches and his knights. Even Luciliano raised his face in surprise. About 3 years ago. I am sure even Viscount Balches remembers the wanted posters of a dark elf who had succumbed to a vampire's temptation circulating around our country. That dark elf's name was Darsa. And I had my own subordinates investigate the matter just in case, and in the process, I learned that the name of the vampire who seduced her is Valen. It is not unusual for parents to use parts of own names to name their child. The son of Valen and Darsa, Vandali. Many commoners name their children in this way. But wasn't that damp returned to the dirt? No, I believe the only one that was certainly executed was his dark elf mother. I heard that the corpse of the damp child who was of breastfeeding age was never found in the end. How irresponsible. Do those of the church demand such extravagant donations for such crude work? However, even being half vampire, there was no way for an infant of breastfeeding age to survive without its mother. Could the name not be a mere coincidence? But even the age matches. Is it not too much to be called a coincidence? The knights offered their own confused guesses. and then they were silenced by Marshal Palpapek's powerful voice. What we should fear is if the damp Vandali, who is the Ghoul King, is not content with merely surviving and is sharpening his fangs for revenge. What will happen then? It does not even need to be said. The knights' expressions all hardened as they closed their mouths. Viscount Balches's face had turned particularly pale. A powerful ghoul army led by a damp who harbored resentment towards the humans. No matter how one looked at it, this was a larger threat than the noble orcs group of monsters. Orcs were unintelligent, and even if they were led by a higher race, their coordination was sloppy and there would be many openings to take advantage of. However, ghouls were far more intelligent than orcs, and they were a race that was even more proficient at fighting in coordination with each other than kobolds. And unlike orcs, among whom only superior individuals could use magic, most female ghouls were capable of casting spells. Their reproductive capabilities were far inferior to those of orcs, but for the noblemen and knights gathered here, that was irrelevant information. Since the ghouls had defeated a group of over 500 orcs, the noblemen had deduced that their numbers would be around the same, or at least 400. Though in reality, the number of effective combatants was only around 200, including Vandali himself and the undead that obeyed his command. When that large army came attacking, its fangs would first be bared at this town that was close by to the Devil's Nest. Nobody could blame the ruler of that town, Viscount Balches, for looking as if he could faint at any moment. Marshal, please grant me your assistance. Of course, Viscount Balches. Let us immediately organize a larger extermination force and eradicate those ghouls and that damp from that Devil's Nest. Marshal Palpapek had managed to secure the organization of a larger extermination force while still having it done under the request of the local ruler. If this operation succeeded and he managed to exterminate the damp that had escaped High Priest Gordon, who was renowned as a vampire hunter, his fame would increase even further. Rather than try to keep guessing at the politics beneath the surface, I must get out of here. You silly Arno didn't want to see that damp's face again. Thinking about that, he continued to wait for his employer to grant him permission to leave. Name, Vigoro rank, 6 race, Ghoul Berserker level, 5 job, non-job level, 100 job history, non-age, 168 years old. Passive skills, night vision, superhuman strength, level 4 pain resistance, level 4 paralyzing venom secretion, claws, level 1. Active skills, axe technique, level 5, level up. Unarmed fighting technique, level 2 commanding, level 3 coordination, level 2. Name, Bazdia rank, 4 race, Ghoul warrior level, 63 job, non-job history, non-age, 26 years old. Passive skills, night vision, superhuman strength, level 3, level up. Pain resistance, level 2 paralyzing venom secretion, claws, level 3. Active skills, axe technique, level 3, level up. Shield technique, level 2, level up. Bow technique, level 2 throwing, level 1 silent steps, level 1 coordination, level 2, level up. Status effects, infertility. Chapter 24, my allies and my enemies cannot be stopped once we start.
Alright guys, so as you can see, the details for the character is going well, and I'm kind of satisfied of the body and the face. Actually, I'm not very sure with the face. I might look at it next time again with a fresh eye if I can still improve it. But yeah, that's some part of me that's like a bit of perfectionist when it comes to the face. So I'll just see if I can still change it next time. I'll see it, but right now I think it's good. The as you have also seen the cape, I kind of corrected the design on it because it was when I was looking at it from the sample, it was kind of kind of not proportionate to the other one, and also not really balanced. So I want to change it, and it's going really well. I think it will look really similar to the game yeah, the design on the game. And next time will be the weapon. Hopefully I can do it justice, make it look beautiful. hmm And then next will be the background. Hopefully I won't spend too much time editing the background after this. I didn't expect that designing, correcting the color or blending the color for the body, for the character would take some time. Yeah, I still need to edit the shrimp also. Mm, but yeah, pretty much this is really good already. I think I'll stop here for now and continue probably in a few days. And hope that you will support me and watch this video, the next video again. And yeah, so I'm glad that you are here watching this video, and also for listening for the audiobook that I was playing. So right now we're in chapter 24, almost reaching volume 2. So right now, he's being hunted by the the priest again. So that he he would probably have some hard time, but I know he would have some good opportunities also to take revenge to those who did some harm on him and his family and his mother. And just look forward with the story that will happen. I I would guarantee that it is a very interesting revenge story also. And yeah, I can't wait for him gaining some more strength so that he can fight against uh, the priest that murdered his mother. And one day he will also manage to be strong enough to fight against the adventurer that actually hunted her mother, hunted his mother. But yeah, we'll that's something that we need to wait for because it will take some time. We're still at volume 2, and I think it's in right now it's at volume 19, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, there's a lot of chapters that we need to go through first before reaching those stories. And okay, so yeah, next time I'll see you again, and hopefully that you will enjoy again the story and the design that I'm doing right now. And I'll see you again. And have a good night or have a good day to all of you that are watching right now. And